This week on The Modified World, we're going to be talking a little bit about septum stretching, so stick around. Welcome to The Modified World, a weekly web show about body modification, the people who do it, the people who get it, and why it matters. I am your host. I'm the senior piercer at the world-renowned PANGEA Piercing in beautiful downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. Purveyor of internet wackiness, you know. That's right. I'm JC Potts, and this week I'd been looking back through the comments on some of my older videos. I was asking you guys, well, which would you rather see, septum stretching or me making jewelry? Well, the votes are in. The first and most important thing about, when you consider stretching a septum is having your septum pierced in the right spot to begin with. Frequently, and I mean frequently, I see all the time when people have, too low, too far back, up into the cartilage, and trying to stretch that only winds up causing you a lot of pain. Possible, sure, but not really something you want to try to do. You want to start off with it in the proper location. High and in the front of the nose. Not really high, but, usually corresponding with the tip of the nose. There's a little thin spot in there. I have a earlier video, septum piercing essentials, that you might want to investigate if you wanted to know more about how septum piercings get done in the proper location for it. If your piercing that you already have is not in an ideal spot, get it re-pierced. Another consideration, that thing needs to be straight. Some people will claim that stretching your septum piercing will cause it to straighten out. Well, in my experience, that's not the case. In my experience, you just wind up with a big, crooked septum piercing. And nobody likes that. It's not a good look. So, of course, you want your piercing to be straight and properly located. Now we make the assumption that you have a septum piercing that is well healed too. And when I say well healed, I would like to have seen your piercing at least established and not having any problems for at least 6 months before you try to start stretching it. But say you do have a septum piercing that is correctly located, straight, and well established. The standard gauging system, 10 gauge, 8 gauge, 6 gauge, 4 gauge, skips a size in between each size going up. And that leaves a little bit to be desired. The smaller increments are a lot less traumatic to the tissue. Now that said, you're probably going to find a much, much, much lower selection of jewelry in between sizes. Your best bet is usually to find some glass pieces, because glass a lot of times will vary just ever so slightly. Especially if you're stretching up to something and you're not at that goal size yet. Go ahead and spend a little bit of money, get something that maybe works really well, but maybe doesn't exactly look like how you dream. Especially in the case of septum retainers. Because they can be worn flipped up inside the nose, you don't really notice it. And that can be exploited to help facilitate the next size up. It's a good thing. You can get septum clickers with adapters that go up to some really large sizes. You'll see people wear large captive bead rings. Circular barbells are always the perennial favorite. Easy to wear, easy to install, and are frequently available in a number of different styles. The classic septum pincher, or crescent as they are sometimes called, another great option. Now, gold, of course, going to be a heck of a lot more of an investment, and really more like what you think of when you think of your forever jewelry, when you actually get to that goal size. You'll find that over about 2 gauge to 0 gauge, your options are going to start getting somewhat limited on septum jewelry. Most of the people I know with really large septums like that are generally going to be wearing a plug or a septum clicker with a large gauge adapter on it. Septum plugs, and I'm sorry I don't have one to display, are generally a double flare short plug with very small flares. Of course, you can always refer to my video on terminology and on jewelry styles to be able to tell what I'm talking about here in case you're confused about what I mean. The bottom line is it's just a narrower plug with a very small flare on either side. Another consideration about stretching your septum up to a large size is at a certain point, and it's different on everyone, you will start to get a little bit of interference in the underlying cartilage inside the septum. Has that little thin spot where we've pierced. Well, once you start stretching to a certain point, the jewelry kind of presses and grinds against that cartilage that's there. It's also a problem that you'll see sometimes with people in this part of their ear when they get to be fairly good size and having the extra pressure there on the cartilage in the ear. It's the same type of problem. I've seen it happen as small as 8 millimeters where people are starting to get into the erosion of the cartilage behind the piercing. And at that point, you're pretty well done stretching, despite what your desire might be to go any larger. It would be something a little more surgical, if you know what I mean. But that's something else completely and entirely. And if that is something that you're genuinely interested in, I would, of course, steer you towards Mr. Von Cyborg to let him do the voodoo that he does so well. Another thing that I've been told, too, from my friends with extra large septums is a limiting factor isn't necessarily just cartilage erosion at the back of the piercing. It's the fact that your nostrils a lot of times aren't really big enough to support large jewelry coming through. Now, say you have a broader nose, maybe larger nostrils, well then largely you'll be able to stretch your septum to a much larger size. Now, if you have a more thin aquiline nose, smaller nostrils, well, biology has somewhat dictated to an extent how large you can go with that. If you are going to be using tapers, there's nothing wrong with that, but of course they need to be sterile, and the jewelry needs to be sterile. And that does not mean soaking in something, that means run through an autoclave. And for that, you're probably going to want to go patronize your local professional piercer. That said though, even with using sterile tools, we're going to want to avoid tearing and damaging the skin. So definitely give it a long time in between stretches. If your jewelry's tight, you don't need to be trying to taper it up. Give it some more time. Believe me, you're going to be a year older next year anyway. Whether or not you damage your septum piercing in that time is entirely up to you. I know that there's always the temptation to, well, at least for some folks, to just cut out the middleman and go for a big size from the get-go with either a scalpeling technique or using a biopsy punch. And that's well beyond the scope of what I even really know about, to be honest with you. I've never punched a septum. I've never scalpeled a septum. I haven't seen it done. I know some folks that have had it done, and I've talked to them a little bit about it, but this is beyond the scope of what we can advise here. This is all about just going up the easy way that anybody can do without damaging themselves, without having major problems or anything like that. Well, that was my show this week. Hope it wasn't too boring. Hope you were somewhat entertained. I hope you got educated a little bit. I'd love to hear from you. So, please hit me up, call the shop, leave me a comment, whatever. It doesn't really matter, but I love hearing from you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you know, hey, this is YouTube, man. We need all the subscribers we can get. So, you know, hey, why not? And be sure to stop back by next week for yet another episode of The Modified World.